The cold had become a constant companion, so familiar that Winter Calloway barely registered the way it seeped through the thin layer of straw beneath her, turning her bones to ice. The dungeon cell measured perhaps 8 feet across, stone walls weeping with moisture that never dried, iron bars so rusted they left orange stains on her fingers when she gripped them in those early days, back when she still believed someone might come. No one had. 5 years had passed in this suffocating darkness, lit only by the single torch in the corridor beyond her cage, its guttering flame casting shadows that moved like living things across walls she had long since memorized, every crack, every stain, every place where previous prisoners had scratched desperate marks into unforgiving stone. She existed rather than lived, each day identical to the last in its grinding monotony. Wake before dawn when the guard changed, his heavy footsteps echoing through the dungeon complex. Receive a wooden bowl of thin gruel, sometimes with weevils floating on its surface, protein she had learned not to refuse. Perform the tasks they demanded, scrubbing floors in the manor above with hands rubbed raw, hauling water from the well until her shoulders screamed, always under Griselda Stoneheart's watchful gaze, that woman who smiled with her mouth but never her cold blue eyes. Return to the cell as darkness fell. Sleep on straw that smelled of mildew and her own unwashed body. Repeat. The iron collar around her neck had become part of her, a band of metal she no longer consciously felt until she tried to remember. Then it burned, a searing pain that drove white-hot spikes through her skull, forcing her thoughts away from the vast emptiness where her past should be. Her memories simply stopped 5 years ago, as if someone had taken a blade and cut away everything that came before. Sometimes, in the space between waking and sleep, fragments surfaced like bodies from deep water. A man's face, kind eyes the color of storm clouds, his voice calling her something that sounded like little flame, the warmth of fire in a great hearth, the scent of pine and snow, and something else, something wild and free that made her chest ache with inexplicable longing. But the moment she reached for these images, tried to hold them, examine them, the collar ignited against her skin, and the memories dissolved like smoke, leaving only the burn and a grief so profound it felt like drowning. She no longer knew her own age, though the cracked mirror in the washing room showed a face too thin, too angular, pale skin stretched over bones that showed too clearly. Her hair hung to her waist in a thick braid she maintained herself, copper red even in the dim light, the one thing she refused to let them take from her. Her body bore the map of her captivity, scars crisscrossing her back from the whip, her knees permanently darkened with bruises from scrubbing stone floors, her hands a ruin of calluses and broken nails. Yet beneath the damage, she could see hints of what she might have been, the structure of cheekbones that spoke of beauty, eyes that shifted from gray to silver depending on the light, a frame that was small but had once perhaps been strong. The isolation gnawed at her more than the physical suffering. She was kept separate from the other servants, forbidden to speak to them on pain of punishment they would receive, not her. A clever cruelty. She worked in silence, ate alone, existed in a void where human connection had been systematically stripped away. The only voices she heard were Griselda's cold commands, and the occasional crude joke from guards who looked through her as if she were already a ghost. Sometimes she caught herself talking aloud in her cell, just to hear a voice, even her own, just to prove she still existed, that she had not yet dissolved entirely into the darkness and the cold and the endless grinding sameness of days without meaning. There was a part of her, buried deep beneath the numbness, that still wanted to live. It surprised her when she found it, this small, stubborn ember that refused to be extinguished. She noticed it in strange moments, the way her heart lifted when sunlight broke through clouds during her brief trips to the well, how she hoarded the memory of birdsong heard through a high window, the fierce satisfaction she felt when she successfully hid a crust of bread in her dress to eat later in her cell, An act of defiance so small it was pathetic, yet it mattered. It meant some part of her had not yet surrendered, had not yet accepted that this was all she would ever be, all she would ever have. The day Griselda descended into the dungeon, Winter knew immediately that something had shifted. The woman rarely came below herself, preferring to summon Winter upward into the light. But here she stood beyond the bars, perfectly groomed even in this place of filth, her severe black hair pulled into its customary tight bun, rings glittering on every finger, her thin lips curved in something that might have been a smile, if smiles could carry such venom. Winter rose from her straw bed, instinct bringing her to her feet, though everything in her wanted to remain down, small, unthreatening. The collar felt heavier suddenly, or perhaps she simply noticed it more, the way it encircled her throat like a promise of violence. "How remarkable that you are still alive," Griselda said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of nobility wrapped around a core of casual cruelty. 5 years in this pit, and you persist, like a rat, like something too stupid to understand it should have died already. Winter said nothing, had learned years ago that speech only invited pain, that silence was the closest thing to safety she could achieve. Her gray eyes remained lowered, fixed on the stone floor, counting the cracks she had counted 1,000 times before. "Look at me when I address you." She lifted her gaze, met those cold blue eyes, saw something in them that made her stomach clench with primal fear. Satisfaction, anticipation, the look of someone about to deliver news they had been savoring, waiting for just the right moment to inflict maximum damage. "The Alpha has made a decision regarding you," Griselda continued, each word precisely enunciated, as if she were discussing something of import rather than the fate of a prisoner who officially did not exist. "You have been chosen for a great honor. You will be sent as tribute to the Beast King of Shadow Peak, as is our tradition, our sacrifice for peace. Is that not generous? That something as worthless as you might serve a purpose before you die?" The words took a moment to penetrate, to arrange themselves into meaning. Winter had heard whispers of the Beast King, fragments of terrified conversation between servants when they thought no one listened. A cursed alpha who lived in a black castle in the northern mountains, who could not control his transformations, who had killed half his own pack in a rage. Every year, Malric Stoneheart sent a sacrifice north, called it diplomacy, called it the price of peace. No one sent ever returned. She should have felt terror, should have broken down, begged, pleaded for mercy that would not come. Instead, what rose in her chest was something she had not felt in 5 years: relief. The nightmare would end. One way or another, the endless cold and isolation and grinding sameness would stop. Death, when it came from the Beast King's claws, would at least be quick. Quicker than this slow dissolution of self, this daily death of spirit that left her hollow. "Nothing to say?" Griselda's smile widened, showing teeth. "No tears? No begging? Perhaps you are even more broken than I thought. Good. The Beast King prefers his tributes compliant. You will be prepared and taken to the boundary stones by nightfall. Pray to whatever gods you remember that he kills you quickly, little rat. Pray that he does not make you suffer first." She left then, her footsteps receding up the stone stairs, the door at the top slamming with a finality that echoed through the dungeon like a period at the end of a sentence. Winter sank back onto her straw, hands trembling now that she was alone, the numbness cracking just enough to let through a flood of chaotic emotion she could not name. Fear, yes, but also something that felt dangerously like hope, and that was the most terrifying thing of all, because hope in a place like this was nothing but another kind of torture, a way to make the end hurt more when it finally came. They came for her as shadows lengthened, 2 guards who hauled her from the cell without gentleness, dragging her upstairs her legs barely remembered how to climb, through corridors where servants turned away rather than look at her. The washing room, where they stripped her, scrubbed her skin with brushes that left it red and raw, dunked her head under freezing water until she choked and gasped. They dressed her in white, a ceremonial gown, too thin for the cold she knew waited in the mountains, fabric that felt obscene against skin accustomed to rags. The collar remained, would always remain. They did not even try to remove it, a brand marking her as property, as less than human, as something to be discarded. The cart waited in the courtyard, wooden and crude, a cage on wheels with iron chains already prepared. They shackled her wrists, her ankles, left just enough slack that she could shift position but never run. Malric himself stood watching, alpha of Northmere Pack, a man gone soft in middle age, but still carrying himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. His face arranged itself into an expression of solemn regret, so false it would have been laughable if Winter had possessed the capacity for laughter. "We do this for the good of all," he announced, projecting his voice so the gathered pack could hear. Perhaps 50 people assembled to witness her departure, their faces carefully blank. "One sacrifice so that many may live in peace. The Beast King demands tribute. We provide. Remember this girl. Remember her service." He did not know her name, had never known her name. She was simply the prisoner in the dungeon, the thing that scrubbed his floors. Disposable, forgettable, already erased. The cart lurched forward, drawn by horses that knew the route without guidance. Winter watched Northmere territory fall away behind her, the manor growing smaller, the gathered crowd dispersing back to their lives, already forgetting her, because she had never mattered enough to remember. The journey took hours, the sun sinking lower with each passing mile, temperature dropping as they climbed into foothills that would become mountains. The driver, an old man who had not spoken a single word, finally stopped where a worn path met the tree line, ancient stones marking a boundary that felt heavier than simple geography, as if the air itself thickened here, warning travelers they approached something other, something dangerous. He unlocked her from the cart, chained her instead to a wooden post driven deep into frozen ground, arranged her like a sacrifice on an altar, because that was what she was. Left a torch burning in a sconce beside her, its light pitifully small against the vast darkness gathering between the trees. Then he climbed back onto his cart and drove away without looking back, the sound of hooves and wheels fading until she was utterly, completely alone. The cold intensified as true night fell, seeping through the thin white gown, making her shake uncontrollably. Winter closed her eyes, tried to find that place of numbness that had protected her for 5 years, but it eluded her now. Fear had finally caught up, flooding her system with animal panic, making her heart hammer against her ribs, her breath come in short gasps that clouded white in the freezing air. She did not want to die. The realization came too late to matter. She did not want this to be the end, chained to a post in darkness, waiting for a monster to come tear her apart. A howl split the night, so massive it seemed to come from the mountains themselves, a sound that vibrated in her chest and turned her bowels to water. The torch beside her guttered and died, plunging everything into blackness so complete she could not see her own hands still chained before her. But she could see eyes, golden and burning like coals, appearing between the trees, growing closer, accompanied by footsteps that shook the ground, each impact a promise of violence, of ending, of teeth and claws, and the brief, terrible pain before nothing. Winter opened her mouth to scream, but no sound emerged, her voice stolen by terror as the darkness itself seemed to take shape, massive and inexorable, coming for her with the inevitability of death, and she understood with perfect clarity that her life, whatever it had been, was over. The shape emerging from darkness was too large to be fully human, moving with a predator's fluid grace that spoke of controlled violence, of power held barely in check. Winter's eyes, adjusting slowly to the absence of torchlight, caught details that her mind struggled to process as anything real. Height that seemed impossible, easily clearing 7 feet, shoulders broad enough to block out the stars behind him, long black hair catching what little moonlight penetrated the forest canopy, some of it pulled back in braids that clicked with bone beads as he moved. And those eyes, burning gold like molten metal, fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare, seen in ways that went beyond the physical. He stopped perhaps 10 feet away, close enough that she could see the rise and fall of his massive chest, hear the low, rumbling growl emanating from somewhere deep inside him, a sound no human throat should produce. The air around him felt different, charged somehow, pressing against her skin like the moment before lightning struck. Winter's chains rattled as she pressed back against the post, animal instinct screaming at her to flee, even as rational thought understood the futility. There was nowhere to run, had never been anywhere to run. Corvus Ironmaw, Alpha King of Shadow Peak, Beast King as the territories called him, had expected another terrified girl, another weeping sacrifice he would have to gently redirect to the village under his protection, another reminder of how thoroughly fear had isolated him from his own kind. He had stopped trying to convince the other packs years ago that he harmed no one, that the tributes were unnecessary, that he was not the monster they believed. They sent them anyway, and he had learned to simply ensure their safety and eventual relocation, a grim ritual that reinforced his exile every single time. But the moment his eyes locked with hers, everything unmade itself. The bond snapped into place like a chain wrapping around his chest and pulling tight, stealing his breath, driving him to his knees on frozen ground. Every nerve in his body ignited simultaneously, pleasure and pain indistinguishable, a sensation like being struck by lightning from the inside out. His wolf, the beast he kept caged through constant vigilance, surged forward with savage joy, recognizing what his human mind was still struggling to comprehend. Mate. His mate. After 31 years of believing himself cursed to be alone, after a decade of isolation and careful control, she was here, chained like an animal, dressed for sacrifice, gray eyes gone wide and silver with terror, and she was his. The curse reacted to the intensity of emotion like oil thrown on fire. Corvus felt his bones begin to shift, the excruciating sensation of his body trying to transform, his wolf demanding to be let out, to claim, to protect, to tear apart anyone who had dared harm what belonged to them. He fought it with everything he had, muscles locked rigid, a roar building in his chest that came out as barely contained snarl. His eyes blazed brighter, gold bleeding into the whites, his hands curling into claws that dug furrows in the frozen earth. Winter watched him fight himself, unable to look away, despite every instinct screaming that she should not witness this, should not see the way his face contorted in agony, the way his body seemed to ripple beneath his clothes, as if something massive was trying to tear free from inside. The collar around her neck suddenly burned white-hot, making her gasp. But beneath the pain, something else was happening. Cracks appeared in the metal, hairline fractures spreading like a spiderweb, and with them came sensations she had no context for, no way to understand. She could feel him, not physically, but somehow deeper, as if a door had opened between them and emotions were flooding through. His shock mirroring her own, his rage directed not at her, but at whoever had chained her here. His terror, raw and overwhelming, fear that he would lose control and harm her, that the curse would win and she would die by his hand before he ever learned her name. And underneath it all, threading through every other emotion like a golden cord, recognition. The bone-deep certainty that she was important, essential, the most crucial thing in his world, even though they had never spoken, even though he knew nothing about her, except that she was his and someone had tried to feed her to a monster. The irony would have been funny if she could remember how to laugh. Do not run. His voice, when he finally managed words, came out rough and strained, each syllable clearly costing him effort. "Please, I will not harm you, but do not run. The wolf sees prey that flees." Winter had not been planning to run, could not run with the chains. But something in his voice, the desperate control barely maintained, made her force words past her own fear-locked throat. "I cannot run. I am chained." The golden eyes fixed on her bonds, and the growl that emerged from him made the trees seem to lean away. She watched him struggle visibly between the need to come closer, to remove the chains, and the knowledge that approaching her while the beast was this close to the surface would be dangerous. His hands opened and closed repeatedly, claws sliding from his fingertips and retracting, bones cracking audibly as they tried to reform and were forced back into human shape through sheer will. The sound of horses approaching broke the terrible tension. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, and Winter recognized the lead figure immediately, even in the dim moonlight. Paxton, though she did not know his name, radiated a different kind of authority, still powerful, but somehow warmer, more controlled. His brown eyes took in the scene with quick efficiency, understanding crossing his face as he dismounted and moved carefully toward his alpha, not between Corvus and Winter, but angled to be visible to both. Corvus, the name spoken quietly but firmly, an anchor being thrown to a drowning man. "Breathe. You are still in control. The wolf has not won." "She is my mate." The words came out mangled, half human, half growl. "My mate, Paxton. They chained my mate and left her as sacrifice. They tried to have me kill my own mate." Even through her confusion and terror, Winter heard the anguish in those words, the rage barely leashed. Paxton's expression shifted to shock, then understanding, then carefully masked concern. He moved slightly closer to Corvus, one hand outstretched in a placating gesture. "Then we protect her, but you cannot free her like this. You know what will happen if you lose control. Let me remove the chains. Let me help her. You need distance until you can shift back fully human." Corvus's whole body shook with the effort of not moving toward her, of not closing that unbearable distance, and taking what every instinct screamed belonged to him. The curse made it worse, feeding on the intensity of his emotions, trying to use his desperate need to protect as fuel for destruction. He had spent 10 years learning to manage it, to keep himself on the knife's edge between man and beast. And in the space of minutes, this fragile, terrified woman had obliterated every carefully constructed defense. "Make certain she understands," Corvus forced out between gritted teeth. "I am not the monster. I will not harm her. She is safe." Then he turned and ran, moving with inhuman speed into the darkness between the trees, and Winter heard the sound that would haunt her sleep for weeks after. A howl of such profound agony and frustrated rage that it seemed to shake the mountains themselves, speaking of a pain that went beyond the physical into something existential, a suffering that had no cure and no end. Paxton approached her carefully, hands visible and empty, moving slowly as one might with a cornered animal. "I am going to remove your chains now. I need you to stay very calm and very quiet. Can you do that?" Winter managed a jerky nod, her throat too tight for words. Her mind was still reeling, trying to process what had just happened, why the collar had burned and cracked, why she had felt things that belonged to the terrifying stranger who had called her his mate, as if that word should mean something to her, as if she should understand the significance of a bond she had never heard of and could not begin to comprehend. The beta's hands were gentle as he unlocked the manacles, catching her when her legs proved too weak to support her weight after hours of standing chained. He wrapped his own heavy cloak around her shoulders, the warmth almost painful against skin gone numb with cold. The other 2 riders, she realized, were also watching her, with expressions that held curiosity but no threat. Warriors who had come because their alpha needed them, but would not harm something he had claimed as his own. "What is your name?" Paxton asked quietly as he lifted her, carrying her toward one of the horses with careful consideration for her obvious weakness. Winter, her voice came out barely above a whisper. Winter Calloway. Something flickered in his expression, too quick to read, there and gone. Winter, a fitting name. I am Paxton, Beta of Shadow Peak. You are safe now. No one will harm you. But I need to take you to the castle, and I need you to trust that, despite what you just witnessed, Corvus will not hurt you. The curse makes control difficult, but he has never harmed anyone who did not attack him first. Do you understand? She did not understand anything, did not understand what a mate was, or why this stranger had looked at her like she was salvation and damnation combined, did not understand why the collar had cracked, or why she could still feel an echo of those golden eyes, as if they had burned an imprint on her soul, did not understand why the carrying away from the place she had expected to die felt less like rescue and more like falling, tumbling into something vast and terrifying and utterly inescapable. But she nodded anyway, because what else could she do? And as Paxton settled her on his horse and mounted behind her, as they began the journey up into mountains that grew steadily darker and colder, Winter Calloway understood with perfect clarity that whatever life she had known before this night, whatever existence she would have had as a forgotten prisoner or a dead sacrifice, it was finished. Something new had begun, something that felt like fate moving with the inevitability of a blade falling, and she was powerless to stop it, could only wait to see if it would cut her free or cut her open, if the end would be salvation or simply a different kind of cage, gold instead of iron, but a cage nonetheless. The howl came again from somewhere in the darkness around them, tracking their progress. And this time, beneath the pain, she heard something else, a promise, a claim, the voice of something that had found what it had been missing and would never, ever let it go. Winter woke in a room carved from darkness itself, or so it seemed in those first disoriented moments of consciousness. Black stone walls rose around her, polished smooth by centuries of wind and weather, reflecting the pale light filtering through narrow windows set high in the walls. The bed beneath her was impossibly soft after 5 years of straw and stone, piled with furs that smelled of pine and winter and something wild she could not name. Her body ached in ways that spoke of exhaustion so profound it had seeped into her bones, but she was warm, clean, and the white sacrificial gown had been replaced with a simple dress of gray wool that fit reasonably well despite being clearly borrowed. The collar remained around her neck, cracked but intact, a reminder that whatever had happened at the boundary stones had changed things but not freed her entirely. She touched it with tentative fingers, felt the fractures in the metal like a map of fault lines, and the moment her skin made contact, memory flooded through with visceral clarity. A great hearth blazing with fire that cast dancing shadows on stone walls. A man lifting her, small child self, spinning her until she shrieked with laughter. His voice, warm and deep, calling her little flame, my fierce little flame. You will be alpha someday, and the pack will be stronger for it. The scent of pine and snow, and that wild musk she now recognized as wolf, as pack, as home. A woman's hands braiding her copper hair, gentle and patient, singing something low and sweet. Safety, belonging, love that felt like sunlight, like being seen and known and cherished. Then darkness, screaming, the sick, wet sound of a blade entering flesh. Her father, storm-gray eyes meeting hers across a room. Room suddenly full of violence, his mouth forming words she could not hear over her own shrieking. Her mother's body crumpling, blood spreading across stone floors. Winter had played on every day of her short life. Hands grabbing her, Malric's face swimming into view, his expression almost apologetic as he forced the collar around her 8-year-old throat, the magic in it igniting like acid, burning away everything she was, everything she knew, leaving only emptiness and pain. Winter came back to herself gasping, tears streaming down her face, the grief of that lost child finally allowed to surface after 15 years of suppression. She was not nameless. She was not nobody. She was Winter Calloway, daughter of Alaric and Moira Calloway, heir to Northmere Pack, and Malric Stoneheart had murdered her parents and stolen everything she was supposed to become. The door opened quietly, and an elderly woman entered, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body no longer obeyed as quickly as her mind demanded. She was small, hunched slightly with age, white hair in a long braid over one shoulder, wearing layers of shawls that smelled strongly of herbs and smoke. Her eyes were cloudy gray, partially blind, but they fixed on Winter with unsettling accuracy, as if she saw things beyond what physical sight could reveal. "You are remembering," the old woman said, her voice surprisingly strong despite her apparent frailty. "The collar is failing. That happens when mate bonds form, especially bonds as strong as yours. Magic tied to suppression cannot survive the formation of something natural, something right." Winter wiped at her tears with shaking hands, trying to compose herself and failing utterly. "Who are you?" "Wren. I am healer here, have been for longer than most of these stones have stood. I tended you when you arrived, half frozen and in shock. You slept for nearly a full day." She moved closer, settling herself on the edge of the bed with a soft grunt of effort. "May I examine the collar?" Winter nodded wordlessly, tilting her head to allow access. Wren's gnarled fingers were surprisingly gentle as they traced the fractures in the metal, her cloudy eyes narrowing in concentration. She made a low humming sound, thoughtful and slightly troubled. "Memory suppression collar. Very old magic, very powerful. Whoever placed this on you wanted you forgotten, wanted you to forget yourself." She pulled back, studying Winter's face with that unnerving perception. But they made a mistake. They used a collar rather than a binding spell, and collars can break, will break with enough pressure. The mate bond is providing that pressure. "I do not understand what a mate bond is." Winter's voice came out small, lost. "I do not understand any of this. Yesterday I was a prisoner waiting to die. Today I am in a castle with a man who called me his mate and looked at me like I was something precious and terrifying at once. Nothing makes sense." Wren's expression softened with something that might have been pity. "You were kept isolated. Whoever held you made certain you learned nothing of pack dynamics, of what we are. That was cruel, but effective." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "We are not entirely human, child. We are wolves who can take human form, and our souls recognize their perfect complement when they meet. That is a mate bond. It happens perhaps once in 1,000 meetings, and when it happens, it cannot be denied or broken. Your soul and Corvus's recognized each other the moment your eyes met. You felt it, whether you understood it or not. Winter had felt something. That much was undeniable. The sensation of drowning in golden eyes, the flood of emotions that were not her own, the way her body had responded to his presence with recognition that bypassed conscious thought entirely. Even now, sitting in this tower room with stone and distance between them, she could feel him like a compass pointing north, a constant awareness of his presence somewhere below, pacing and restless and fighting for control. "He called himself cursed," Winter said quietly. "What did he mean?" Wren's face darkened, grief and anger warring in her clouded eyes. 10 years ago, Corvus killed the son of a powerful witch in battle. Fair combat, witnessed and sanctioned, but the witch cared nothing for honor. She cursed him, so that transformation would be agony, so that his wolf would become uncontrollable, destructive. He partially transformed during a pack gathering and killed 17 of his own people before Paxton and the other betas managed to contain him. Since then, he has lived in isolation, accepting no closeness, allowing no one near enough to trigger the emotions that bring the wolf forward. He believed himself incapable of having a mate, believed the curse would prevent the bond from forming. "But it formed anyway," Winter whispered. "It formed anyway," Wren confirmed. "Which means either the witch's magic was imperfect,
or mate bonds are stronger than curses. I do not know which. What I do know is that Corvus is terrified of harming you, and that terror is making
A curse worse. Strong emotion feeds it. And what could be stronger than finding your mate after believing yourself condemned to eternal isolation? Winter absorbed this, turning it over in her mind alongside her returning memories, trying to reconcile the monster she had been sent to with the man who had dropped to his knees in recognition, who had run rather than risk hurting her, whose anguish she had felt like her own pain. What happens now? Now you rest, you recover, and you give Corvus time to regain control. He will want to see you, to speak with you, but he will maintain distance until he is certain the wolf is fully leashed. Paxton will likely come soon with questions. They will have investigated who sent you and why. Wren stood slowly, joints audibly creaking. But first, you should eat. You are half-starved, and healing requires fuel. She left, returning minutes later with a tray laden with more food than Winter had seen in months. Fresh bread still warm from ovens, butter and honey, roasted meat, vegetables in thick gravy, a flagon of water, and another of weak ale. Winter stared at it, overwhelmed, unsure where to even begin. Wren smiled, a rare softening of her weathered face. Eat slowly. Your stomach has forgotten abundance. I will return later to check the collar again. She paused at the door, looking back with that penetrating, cloudy gaze. Winter Calloway. That is your true name, yes? Winter froze with bread halfway to her mouth. How did you know? I know many things these old eyes should not see, including that you are not what you appear, and Malric Stoneheart made a grave error in sending you here. The dead should stay buried, but sometimes they rise, and when they do, those who put them in the ground learn to fear. She left before Winter could formulate a response, the door closing with a soft thud that felt like punctuation. Winter ate mechanically, her mind spinning through revelations like a mill grinding grain. She was Alpha-born. Her parents had been murdered. Malric had stolen her pack, her identity, her entire life. And now she was mate-bonded to a cursed Alpha King who lived in isolation because his own power had become a weapon he could not fully control. The universe had a truly vicious sense of irony. Paxton arrived as she was finishing the meal, knocking softly before entering. In daylight filtering through the high windows, he looked less intimidating than he had in darkness, his sandy blonde hair slightly disheveled, his brown eyes tired but kind. He carried himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to authority but not drunk on it, a man who led because he was good at it, not because he craved power. "How are you feeling?" he asked, settling into the room's single chair with the careful posture of someone prepared to leave quickly if necessary. "Overwhelmed," Winter answered honestly. "Confused, angry, grateful, too many things at once." "That seems reasonable, given circumstances." He studied her with open curiosity. "Wren says the collar is memory suppression magic, that you are beginning to remember things. May I ask who you were before someone tried to erase you?" Winter met his gaze steadily, making a decision in the span of a heartbeat. "I am Winter Calloway, daughter of Alaric Calloway, who was Alpha of Northmere Pack until Malric Stoneheart murdered him 15 years ago. Malric took my pack, took my identity, kept me prisoner for 5 years before sending me here to die." Paxton's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to track, landing on grim understanding. Alaric Calloway. I knew of him. Good man, strong alpha. His death was reported as a challenge gone wrong, and his heir was said to have died in the same conflict. But you survived. I survived because Malric wanted me to forget I had ever been anyone worth killing properly. The collar made certain I would not remember, would not threaten his stolen authority. But he grew afraid, I think, afraid that somehow the magic would fail. So he sent me here disguised as tribute, hoping the Beast King would do what he was too cautious to do himself.
He wanted Corvus to kill you and bury the evidence. Paxton's voice had gone flat, cold in a way that suggested he was capable of violence when circumstances warranted. And instead, Corvus found his mate. Malric must be losing his mind, wondering what went wrong. What will Corvus do? Winter asked quietly. About Malric? That will be Corvus's decision to make, and yours when you are ready. But first, we deal with more immediate concerns. Malric sent a message this morning requesting an audience, claiming need to discuss border disputes. The timing is suspicious. He wants to confirm I am dead, or, if I survived, to finish what he started before I remember too much. That would be my assessment as well. Paxton leaned forward, his expression serious, which means we need to decide how to proceed. Corvus wants to see you, to speak with you properly, but he is still fighting for control, and proximity to you makes the curse worse, not better. The mate bond demands closeness, and the curse feeds on the intensity of what he feels. Winter thought of those golden eyes, the anguish in them, the desperate need warring with equally desperate fear. Something in her chest tightened, an ache that had nothing to do with her own trauma and everything to do with a man she did not know, but somehow understood in ways that transcended rational thought. I want to see him too, she admitted softly. I do not know why. I should be terrified, but I am not. Or I am, but not of him. Does that make sense? More sense than you might think. The mate bond affects both parties. You feel drawn to him because your soul recognizes his, and he is likely pacing holes in the floor below, trying to resist the urge to come up here and ensure you are truly safe. Paxton stood, moving toward the door. I will tell him you wish to speak. He will come, but he will maintain distance. Please do not take his caution as rejection. He is trying to protect you from himself. After he left, Winter moved to the narrow window, peering out at the landscape far below. Shadow Peak Castle perched on a mountain like a predator crouched to spring, black stone stark against gray sky, surrounded by peaks that vanished into low clouds. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, a place that did not pretend to be anything other than what it was, wild, isolated, dangerous. She understood, suddenly, why Corvus had come here. It was a place that matched what he had become, a fortress against a world that feared him, a self-imposed exile that kept others safe from the beast he could not fully control. And now she was here, a complication he had never anticipated, a mate he had believed impossible, and she could feel through that strange new awareness between them that he was approaching, climbing the tower stairs, each step measured and careful, his control a fragile thing that could shatter at any moment. Winter turned from the window and waited, her heart hammering against her ribs, to meet the eyes of the man whose soul had recognized hers in the darkness, and to begin to understand what that recognition would demand from them both. The door opened slowly, deliberately, and Corvus Ironmaw entered like a man approaching a cliff edge, every movement controlled to the point of rigidity. In the gray light filtering through the tower windows, Winter could see him properly for the first time, not the half-monster of darkness and desperation, but the man beneath the curse. He was still massive, his height requiring him to duck slightly through the doorframe, shoulders broad enough that he seemed to fill the space entirely. His black hair was pulled back now, revealing a face of sharp angles and hard lines, handsome in the way a blade was handsome, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. The amber gold eyes that had blazed with inhuman light now watched her with carefully banked intensity, human enough, but barely, the wolf always visible just beneath the surface. He stopped just inside the door, maintaining perhaps 15 feet of distance, his hands hanging loose at his sides in a deliberate display of non-threat. She could see the tension in every line of his body, the effort it cost him to remain still when everything in him clearly wanted to move closer, to touch, to confirm the reality of her presence. The air between them felt charged, heavy with things unspoken, with a connection neither of them fully understood, but both felt with unavoidable clarity. Winter. Her name in his rough voice sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. Not fear, but recognition, her body responding before her mind could intervene. I wanted to apologize for last night. You were terrified enough without witnessing me lose control. That is not how I wished our first meeting to proceed. His formality was a shield, she realized, a way to impose structure on a situation that felt wildly chaotic, dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical threat and everything to do with the way her heart was beating too fast, the way she could not seem to look away from his eyes, even though holding his gaze felt like touching fire. "You did not harm me," Winter said quietly. "You ran rather than risk it. That is more control than you credit yourself with." Something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps, or gratitude, there and gone too quickly to read. "Paxton tells me you are remembering, that the collar is failing and your true identity is returning. Winter Calloway." She touched the cracked metal at her throat absently. "Daughter of Alaric Calloway, who was Alpha of Northmere until Malric Stoneheart murdered him and took everything that should have been mine. I was 8 years old when they put this collar on me and erased who I was. I have been Malric's prisoner for 5 years, since the magics finally made me forget I should resist captivity." Corvus's eyes blazed brighter for just a moment, rage bleeding through his careful control, a low growl building in his chest before he forcibly swallowed it. He sent his Alpha's daughter, his rightful heir, as sacrifice. He tried to have me kill you
and bury the evidence of his crimes. That would be an accurate assessment, Winter agreed, surprised by her own steadiness. Something about his presence, despite the obvious danger, felt grounding rather than destabilizing. Though I suspect he did not anticipate the mate bond complicating his plan. No one could have anticipated that. Corvus moved slightly, not closer, but to the side, restless energy needing outlet. I believed myself incapable of having a mate. The curse has isolated me for a decade. I have touched no one, allowed no one close, kept myself separate because the alternative was more death. And then you were there, chained and terrified, and every certainty I build my existence upon dissolved in the space between one breath and the next. The raw honesty in his words struck something deep in Winter's chest, recognition of a loneliness that mirrored her own. Isolation enforced by different circumstances, but equally absolute. "I do not know what a mate bond means," she admitted. "I do not know what you expect from me, or what I should expect from you. Ren explained the basics, but understanding intellectually and understanding in practice are different things entirely." "I expect nothing," Corvus said firmly, his eyes finding hers and holding. "You have had every choice stolen from you for 15 years. I will not add to that theft by demanding you accept a bond you did not choose, did not ask for. The mate bond exists whether we will it or not, but how we navigate it, that is something we decide together." Winter had not expected that, had braced herself for demands or assumptions of ownership, the way Malric and Griselda had treated her as property to be used as they saw fit. The offer of choice, of agency in a situation that felt fundamentally beyond her control, loosened something tight in her chest that she had not realized was constricting her breathing. "What do you want?" she asked, turning the question back to him. Corvus was silent for a long moment, something like pain crossing his features. "I want to know you are safe. I want whoever hurt you to answer for it. I want to be close to you without fearing I will lose control and harm you. I want many things I have no right to want and cannot have until the curse is broken or managed better than I have managed it thus far. Ren said strong emotion feeds the curse, that you fighting it makes it worse. Strong emotion, particularly rage or fear, brings the wolf forward uncontrollably. I have lived for 10 years in careful emotional neutrality, allowing myself to feel as little as possible, maintaining isolation so nothing and no one could trigger the transformation. It has been effective, if profoundly lonely."
his mouth twisted in something too bitter to be a smile. And then you arrived and rendered a decade of careful control completely useless in approximately 30 seconds. Winter found herself almost smiling at that, a strange urge given the circumstances. I seem to have complicated your existence significantly. You have destroyed my existence and offered the possibility of a different one in its place. I am not certain which terrifies me more. He moved again, pacing like the caged wolf he essentially was, unable to be still. Malric has requested an audience. He arrives in 3 days. Paxton believes he wants to confirm you are dead, or, if you survived, to retrieve you under some pretense before you remember enough to threaten him. He will recognize me the moment he sees me, collar or no collar. I have my father's eyes. Winter felt cold certainty settle in her bones. And when he recognizes me, he will try to finish what he started 15 years ago. He will not touch you. The words came out flat, absolute, backed by such certainty that it felt like a physical force in the room. I do not care what political complications arise. You are under my protection, and I do not surrender what is mine. The possessiveness should have frightened her, reminded her too much of captivity, of being property. Instead, it felt like safety, like someone finally standing between her and harm after years of facing threats alone and defenseless. What do? We prepare. We gather evidence of Malric's crimes. We present the truth before witnesses so he cannot simply make you disappear again. Corvus finally stopped pacing, his eyes intense on hers. But first, we need time. Time for you to recover physically and emotionally. Time for more memories to return. Time for me to regain enough control that I can be in the same room with you without constantly fighting transformation. Over the days that followed, a strange routine established itself. Winter remained primarily in the tower room, recovering her strength under Ren's watchful care, eating properly for the first time in years, feeling her body slowly remember what it meant to be something other than a vessel for suffering. The collar continued to crack and fracture, each break accompanied by floods of memory that left her gasping and raw. She remembered her childhood in fragments, her father teaching her to track game through winter forests, her mother's patient instruction in politics and pack dynamics, the weight of expectation that came with being alpha-born, but also the love, the certainty that she was valued for herself and not just her future position. She remembered the night of the murders in terrible detail, each viewing adding layers she had missed as a traumatized child. Malric's false apologies as he forced the collar onto her, Griselda's cold satisfaction, the way they had kept her alive, not from mercy, but from caution, unwilling to create a martyr, but equally unwilling to let her threaten their stolen power. The memories hurt, reopening wounds that had never properly healed, but they also returned pieces of herself she had not realized were missing, identity slowly reforming like broken bone knitting itself back together. Corvus visited her twice daily, morning and evening, never staying long, always maintaining careful distance. They talked, cautious conversations that slowly deepened as they learned each other in small increments. He told her of his life before the curse, the weight of kingship accepted young when his father died in battle, the responsibility of protecting territories that stretched from the northern ice to the central forests. She told him of fragmented memories returning, of the girl she had been and the woman she was trying to become, of rage at what had been stolen and uncertainty about what remained. There were moments of startling intimacy despite the physical distance. The way his eyes tracked her every movement, not threatening but protective, as if he was memorizing her. The way she found herself listening for his footsteps on the tower stairs, her pulse quickening with anticipation she did not fully understand. The careful way he spoke to her, never commanding but always honest, treating her as an equal, even though she was recovering and dependent, while he was alpha king of vast territories. It built something between them, fragile but real, trust forming in the spaces carved out by shared honesty. On the fourth day, Wren brought Winter to the castle courtyard for the first time, insisting that she needed movement and sunlight if she was to continue healing properly. The courtyard was vast, enclosed by black stone walls that rose 4 stories high. The ground hard-packed earth currently dusted with early snow. Guards trained in one corner, their practice swords clacking rhythmically. Servants moved with purpose between buildings, glancing at Winter with curiosity but no hostility, word having spread apparently that she was not a prisoner, but something other, something important. Corvus found her there, watching the guards with an expression he could not quite read. He approached more closely than he had allowed himself in the tower, stopping, perhaps 6 feet away, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his massive frame, smell pine and winter and that wild musk that her wolf self recognized, even though she had not shifted in 5 years. "You are watching them like you wish to join," he observed. "My father taught me to fight." The memory was new, returned just that morning. He said Alpha-born needed to be able to defend themselves and their pack, that strength came in many forms, but physical capability mattered. I was adequate with a blade before they took me. Now I am nothing. 5 years of captivity have stolen whatever skill I once possessed. Corvus was quiet for a moment, then moved decisively, calling across the courtyard, "Paxton, bring practice blades." The beta complied, tossing 2 wooden swords across the space. Corvus caught them easily, offered one to Winter. "Show me what you remember." She took the sword, feeling the weight of it, the balance. Her hands remembered the grip, even if her body had forgotten the movements. "You want to spar with me? I will last perhaps 30 seconds before you disarm me. Then you will learn to last 40 seconds next time. Your father was right. Strength matters. But more than that, you need to remember you are capable of defending yourself, that you are not helpless, even though circumstances rendered you powerless. That matters for what is coming." He moved into a ready stance, easy and practiced. "And I need to practice maintaining control in close proximity. This serves both purposes." What followed was less sparring and more instruction, Corvus patiently walking her through basic forms her body half remembered, correcting her stance and grip with verbal guidance rather than touch, working around the constraint of distance. She was clumsy and weak, frustration building as her body refused to obey the way memory insisted it once had. But there were moments, brief flashes where muscle memory emerged, and she executed a parry or riposte correctly, where she felt like something more than a victim, like someone who might be dangerous given time and training. They stopped when she was breathing hard and sweating despite the cold. Corvus had barely exerted himself, but his eyes held something that looked like satisfaction, even pride. "You have instinct."
Instinct. The rest will return with practice. Over the following days, they established new routines. Morning conversations in the tower, where they talked of memories and politics and the situation with Malric. Afternoon training in the courtyard, where Winter slowly, painfully, remembered how her body could move when it was not starved and beaten into submission. Evening meals brought to the tower, where they sat on opposite sides of the room and shared food and silence, comfortable with each other in ways that should not be possible given how little time had passed, but somehow were, the mate bond creating intimacy that bypassed normal progression. Winter felt herself changing, strengthening, not just physically, but fundamentally. The helpless prisoner was dissolving, revealing underneath someone harder, angrier, more certain of her right to exist and demand justice. Corvus saw it happening and did nothing to temper it, instead seeming to encourage her growing fierceness, as if he understood that she needed to reclaim not just memory, but agency, the ability to choose and act and determine her own fate. On the 7th day, Wren examined the collar and declared it would likely shatter completely within the week. "When it does, all your memories will return at once. It will be overwhelming and possibly dangerous if you are alone. You should have someone with you when it happens." That evening, Winter told Corvus what Wren had said. They were in the tower, the space between them reduced to perhaps 8 feet now, close enough to speak quietly, far enough that the mate bond pulled painfully but not unbearably. His control had improved with exposure,
The wolf learning that winter was not a threat, that proximity did not require claiming or defending, that they could simply exist near each other. "I will be there," he said simply. "When the collar breaks, I will be there. You should not face that alone." "It will be difficult for you," Winter said carefully. "My distress will trigger the wolf. Then I will fight it. I have fought it for 10 years. I can continue fighting it for you." His eyes held hers, golden and intense and absolutely certain. "You are not alone anymore, Winter. Whatever is coming, we face it together." The words settled into her chest like an anchor, like something she could tether herself to when the world tried to pull her under. She had been alone for so long, isolated and forgotten, that the simple promise of presence felt revolutionary, like being offered air after years of suffocation. "Together," she repeated softly, and knew with bone-deep certainty that Malric Stoneheart's arrival in 2 days would shatter more than just the fragile piece of Shadow Peak. It would shatter the lies he had built his stolen power upon, and Winter Calloway, returned from the dead and claimed by the Beast King, would make certain he answered for every drop of blood he had spilled, every year he had stolen, every moment of suffering he had inflicted. She was no longer helpless. She was no longer alone, and she was done being a victim. Malric Stoneheart arrived at Shadow Peak Castle with 20 warriors, a diplomatic delegation sized precisely to suggest strength without overthreat, a carefully calculated display that spoke to his political cunning. Winter watched from a high tower window as the procession entered per the main gates, her hands gripping the stone sill hard enough that her knuckles went white. Even at this distance, even after 15 years, she recognized him. The way he sat his horse with false dignity, the rings glittering on his fingers, the manufactured expression of solemn duty he wore like a mask. Rage flooded through her, hot and clean, so intense that the collar against her throat sparked and crackled, new fractures spreading across its surface like lightning frozen in metal. Beside Malric rode Griselda, and that was unexpected, that Winter inhaled sharply. The woman sat side saddle on a gray mare, her severe black dress and tight bun unchanged, sharp features arranged in an expression of cold assessment as her eyes swept across Shadow Peak's courtyard. Corvus had mentioned Malric requested to bring his Luna, claiming her presence would demonstrate peaceful intentions, and Paxton had allowed it after debate. Now, watching Griselda's calculating gaze, Winter understood the true purpose. Malric had brought his wife because her magic could detect things normal senses could not, and if Winter was somehow alive, Griselda would find her. "You should not be here," Corvus's voice came from behind her, and Winter turned to find him standing in the doorway, his expression tight with concern. "If Griselda has any magical sensitivity, she might detect your presence even from a distance. She brought herself, which means Malric is uncertain whether I survived. He needed her abilities to confirm." Winter moved away from the window, her mind racing through implications. "We planned for me to remain hidden until we gathered more evidence, until we could present a case before neutral witnesses. But if she finds me, Malric will act immediately. He cannot allow me to speak, cannot allow anyone to question why Northmere's alpha heir is alive and imprisoned." Then we change plans. Corvus moved into the room fully, closing the distance between them to perhaps 4 feet, the closest he had allowed himself outside of their training sessions. His eyes blazed with barely contained fury, the wolf very close to the surface. "We do not give him the opportunity to make you disappear. We confront him now, publicly, before he can manufacture a narrative. Without evidence, it becomes my word against his, a girl with a memory suppression collar and convenient story against an established alpha with 15 years of unchallenged rule." Winter shook her head, frustration warring with fear. "He will claim I am delusional, that the collar was placed for my own protection after some trauma, that he graciously cared for me despite my madness. People will believe him because the alternative requires accepting they followed a murderer for over a decade." The sound of footsteps on the tower stairs preceded Paxton's arrival, the beta entering quickly, his expression grim. Malric is settled in the guest quarters. He has requested a formal audience in the Great Hall within the hour to discuss his supposed border concerns. Griselda is already wandering the castle, claiming interest in the architecture. His brown eyes found Winter. She is looking for you. Her magic leaves traces, like oil on water. Wren can sense it. How long before she pinpoints my location? Winter asked. Hours, perhaps. Shadow Peak is large and heavily warded, which interferes with detection magic, but she is skilled and determined. Paxton looked to Corvus. We need a decision. Hide Winter and risk Griselda eventually finding her, or reveal her presence on our terms. Corvus was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant, clearly weighing options. When he spoke, his voice carried the absolute authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that determined life and death. We reveal her, but not as prisoner or victim. Winter, how much do you remember of pack politics and formal challenges? Enough. Winter felt her heart begin to race, understanding forming. An alpha who murders another alpha outside a formal challenge has no legitimate claim to the territory. If I can prove my identity and Malric's crime before witnesses, his authority is void. And if his authority is void, every decision he has made, every alliance he has formed, every treaty he has signed becomes questionable. Other alphas will turn on him to protect their own legitimacy. Corvus's eyes met hers, gold and intense. But it requires you to face him directly to withstand whatever lies or threats he manufactures. It will not be easy or safe. Nothing about my life has been easy or safe for 15 years. Winter straightened her shoulders, feeling something settle into place inside her, determination hardening into resolve. I am done hiding. I am done being powerless. If Malric came here to confirm my death, let him find me very much alive and ready to reclaim what he stole. They prepared quickly. Winter dressed in borrowed finery, a gown of deep gray that matched her eyes. Her copper hair braided in the style of Alpha-born rather than hanging loose like a servant's. The collar remained visible, its cracks obvious, a piece of evidence she would not hide. Wren applied subtle cosmetics that made Winter look less like someone recently starved and more like nobility, masking the worst of her gauntness. When she looked in the polished metal mirror, she barely recognized herself, seeing instead echoes of her mother's face, the resemblance strong enough that anyone who had known Moira Calloway would see it immediately. The Great Hall of Shadow Peak was a vast space of black stone and soaring ceilings, lit by hundreds of candles in iron chandeliers that cast dancing shadows across walls decorated with banners from territories sworn to Corvus's authority. A massive fireplace dominated one end, flames roaring high enough to provide heat that barely cut the perpetual chill of the mountain castle. The Alpha's throne sat on a raised dais, carved from a single piece of dark wood and inlaid with silver in wolf designs, imposing and ancient and carrying weight of centuries of rule. Malric stood in the center of the hall with his 20 warriors arrayed behind him, Griselda at his right hand, both of them projecting confidence bordering on arrogance. Corvus sat on his throne with Paxton standing to his left, and the hall was filled with perhaps 60 of Shadow Peak's pack members, warriors and servants and craftsmen summoned to witness what was officially a diplomatic meeting, but what everyone understood might become something far more significant. Winter entered through a side door, Wren accompanying her, moving slowly enough that her arrival drew every eye in the hall. She watched Malric's face, saw the moment of casual dismissal as he glanced toward the movement, then the double take, the shock that he could not quite hide, the color draining from his face as recognition struck him like a physical blow. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, and for perhaps 5 seconds he was utterly speechless, his careful political mask shattered by genuine disbelief. Griselda reacted faster, her sharp intake of breath barely audible, her cold blue eyes widening fractionally before narrowing with calculation. She stepped slightly forward, her hand moving in a subtle gesture, and Winter felt the wash of magic roll over her like cold water, probing and invasive. The collar heated against her throat in response, its failing magic reacting to external pressure, and more cracks spread across its surface with small sounds like breaking ice. "That is impossible," Malric said finally, his voice hoarse, all pretense of diplomatic composure abandoned. "You are dead. You died 15 years ago." "Clearly not." Winter's voice carried across the hall, steady despite the fear churning in her stomach, despite the way her hands wanted to shake. "Though you certainly tried to ensure it, Malric Stoneheart, first with a blade through my father's back, then with a collar designed to erase my identity, and finally by sending me here as sacrifice, hoping the Beast King would finish what you lacked the courage to complete yourself." The hall erupted in murmurs, pack members exchanging shocked looks, the warriors behind Malric shifting uneasily. Malric himself recovered his composure with visible effort, his expression rearranging itself into something that suggested confused concern rather than panic. "I do not know what lies you have been told, girl, but Alaric Calloway died in a formal challenge, witnessed and sanctioned. His daughter died with him. You are clearly disturbed, and that collar suggests you have been managed for your own protection." "The collar was placed by you when I was 8 years old, after I watched you murder my father in his own hall, after your wife poisoned my mother in her bed." Winter took a step forward, feeling Wren's supportive presence at her back. "You kept me prisoner for 5 years, used memory suppression magic to ensure I would not remember what you had done, then sent me here to die when you feared the magic might fail." "Madness and delusion." Malric's voice strengthened, gaming the confidence of someone used to controlling narratives. "This girl is clearly unwell. Corvus, I do not know what game you are playing, but using a damaged girl to make accusations against a legitimate alpha is beneath even your reputation." Corvus rose from his throne, and the temperature in the hall seemed to drop 10 degrees, his presence suddenly overwhelming, dangerous, in ways that had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with power barely leashed. His eyes blazed gold, and when he spoke, his voice carried the growl of the wolf threading through human words. "Careful what you accuse me of, Stoneheart. Winter Calloway is my mate, discovered when you sent her here chained and terrified. The bond does not lie. I know her truth as intimately as I know my own heartbeat." That revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled pack, voices rising in surprise. Mate bonds were sacred, unchallengeable, and for Corvus to claim Winter as mate was to throw his entire authority behind her accusations. Malric's face went from pale to flushed with rage, his careful control finally cracking. "You cannot seriously believe this fantasy. She is nobody, nothing, a prisoner with delusions." "She is Winter Calloway, daughter of Alaric and Moira Calloway, rightful alpha of Northmere Pack." Corvus descended from the dais, moving toward Winter with deliberate steps, positioning himself slightly between her and Malric in a display of protection that was unmistakable. "And you are the usurper who murdered her parents and stole her birthright. Did you truly believe that sending her to me would bury the evidence, that I would kill my own mate and ask no questions?" Griselda finally spoke, her voice cold and sharp. "The girl is a liar and a threat. That collar proves she required magical restraint. My husband showed her mercy when he should have executed her for her crimes." "What crimes?" Winter demanded, rage finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure. "I was 8 years old when you forced that collar onto me. What crimes does a child commit that require her identity to be erased and her life stolen?" You killed your own parents in a fit of madness, Griselda said smoothly, the lie emerging with practiced ease. The trauma fractured your mind. The collar was meant to give you peace, to allow you to forget the horror of what you had done. We cared for you despite your crimes, and this is how you repay that mercy. The accusation was clever, Winter recognized with cold clarity. It inverted the truth in ways that would be difficult to disprove, that played on fears of unstable power in the young. She felt the mood in the hall shift, uncertainty rippling through the pack members, doubt creeping in. Malric saw it too, his confidence returning as he seized on his wife's narrative. "We should have executed you," he said, his voice taking on tones of false sorrow. "But I could not."
Bring myself to kill a child, even one who had done something so terrible. I hoped the collar would allow you to live some semblance of a normal life. Instead, you have constructed elaborate fantasies to avoid accepting what you did. I am sorry, truly, but you cannot be allowed to spread these lies. He moved then, faster than Winter anticipated, his hand reaching for her with clear intent to seize and remove her from the hall before she could speak further. But he had forgotten, or never truly understood, what it meant that Corvus had claimed her as mate. The Alpha King moved with inhuman speed, interposing himself between Malric and Winter, one massive hand catching Malric's wrist and stopping his advance with such force that bone audibly cracked. "You will not touch her." The words emerged as pure growl, Corvus's eyes now completely gold, his control visibly fraying. "You will not speak to her. You will not look at her, or I will forget every political consideration and tear out your throat where you stand." Malric stumbled back, cradling his injured wrist, his face contorted with pain and fury. "You threaten me? An established alpha on a diplomatic mission because of a mad girl's accusations? I threaten you because you are a murderer and a liar who sent my mate to die." Corvus's voice was barely human now, the transformation beginning despite his efforts to contain it, his bones cracking as they tried to reshape, his skin rippling. "Leave my territory, now, before I lose control and your death becomes unavoidable." Griselda pulled at her husband's arm, her expression calculating, recognizing that they had lost this confrontation, that remaining would only lead to violence they could not win. "We will leave, but this is not finished. Other alphas will hear of this, will judge whether a cursed king's word can be trusted over established rule. Come, Malric." They retreated, the 20 warriors following, moving quickly toward the hall's main doors. But Griselda paused at the threshold, looking back at Winter with an expression that held something strange, something that might almost have been recognition or regret, there and gone too quickly to interpret. Then they were gone, the massive doors slamming shut behind them, and the hall erupted in chaos. Corvus remained frozen in place, fighting the transformation with visible agony, his massive frame shaking with effort. Paxton was at his side immediately, speaking low and urgent, trying to talk him down from the edge. Winter moved without thinking, stepping close despite Paxton's warning gesture, close enough to touch, though she did not, close enough that Corvus's gold eyes focused on her with desperate intensity. "I am safe," she said quietly, just for him. "You protected me. I am safe. You can let go of the rage now." His breathing gradually slowed, the gold in his eyes dimming slightly, bones settling back into human configuration with sounds that made Winter wince in sympathy. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw. "That was dangerously close. But you maintained control. That is what matters." Winter looked around the hall, at the pack members watching them with expressions ranging from shock to speculation to something that might have been approval. "They will talk about me, about my accusations, about whether Malric spoke truth." "Let them talk," Corvus said, his voice gaining strength. "Malric fled rather than face formal investigation. That speaks louder than any defense." And he made a critical error.
What error? He confirmed he knew about the collar, claimed it was placed for your protection after trauma. But if you were mad and dangerous as he claims, why would he send you here as sacrifice? Why not execute you properly or keep you imprisoned? His story has holes, and people will notice those holes, will question. Corvus finally looked away from her, addressing the assembled pack. What you witnessed here today will be spoken of in every territory by tomorrow. Winter Calloway has returned from death, and Malric Stoneheart's crimes have been exposed. How we proceed from here will determine not just her fate, but the stability of every pack that shares borders with Northmere. We must be careful and deliberate. But even as he spoke of caution and deliberation, Winter felt the collar at her throat give one final crack, deep and resonant, and she knew with absolute certainty that Malric would not wait for careful proceedings or formal investigations. He would act, quickly and violently, because he had nothing left to lose and everything to fear from a dead girl who had learned to speak her truth aloud. The confrontation in the Great Hall had not ended anything. It had simply announced the beginning of a war, and Winter Calloway, who had spent 5 years learning how to survive, would now have to learn how to fight. The collar shattered completely 3 hours after Malric's departure, fragmenting into pieces that fell away from Winter's throat like chains finally broken. And with its destruction came the deluge. Every suppressed memory returned simultaneously, 15 years of stolen life crashing through her consciousness in an overwhelming flood that drove her to her knees in the tower room, gasping and choking on recollections that felt more real than the present moment. She was 8 years old again, hiding behind a tapestry as her father fought 3 men at once, his wolf form magnificent and terrible, taking wounds meant to slow rather than kill because they wanted him conscious for what came next. She was screaming as Malric's blade pierced her father's back, the betrayal in Alaric's storm-gray eyes as he looked at his trusted friend turned murderer. She was being held down as the collar closed around her throat, the magic igniting like acid eating through her mind, consuming her identity, her memories, everything she was until only emptiness remained. Corvus was there, as he had promised, maintaining careful distance but present, his voice a steady anchor as Winter drowned in the past. Breathe. You are here, you are safe, you are Winter Calloway, and no one can take that from you again. Breathe. She clung to his voice, used it to pull herself back to the present, to the tower room and the man watching her with barely controlled desperation, wanting to help, but unable to come closer without risking transformation. When she could finally speak, her voice emerged broken and raw. I remember all of it, every moment. He made me watch. Malric made me watch my father die, made certain I understood what was happening before he used the collar to erase it. That was the cruelty, not just the murder, but ensuring I knew, ensuring I suffered the full weight of loss before stealing even the memory of what I had lost. I am going to kill him. Corvus's words were not threat or bluster, but simple statement of fact, delivered with the certainty of inevitable outcome, slowly, painfully, in ways that ensure he understands exactly what he took from you before he dies. Winter wanted to argue, to claim she needed to be the one to deliver justice, but exhaustion was crashing over her in waves, the psychological toll of recovered memory combining with physical weakness to render her nearly insensible. Wren appeared with tea laced with herbs meant to help her sleep, and she drank it gratefully, letting unconsciousness claim her before the memories could resurface and drown her again. She woke to chaos. Voices raised in alarm, the sound of running feet, Paxton's commanding tone cutting through confusion with sharp orders. Winter forced herself upright despite her body's protests, stumbling to the door and wrenching it open to find the corridor beyond filled with warriors moving with urgent purpose. One of them, a young man with a nasty cut across his shoulder, saw her and stopped. "My lady, you should return to your room. There has been an attack." "What attack? Where is Corvus?" Winter's heart hammered against her ribs, primal fear flooding her system. Malric's forces ambushed the escort, taking you and the healer to the village. But you were not in the cart. The healer Wren was, though. They took her. The warrior's expression was grim. The Alpha has gone after them. Paxton is organizing a larger force to follow. Winter's mind raced through implications, even as her stomach dropped with dread. Malric had moved faster than anticipated, and he had targeted Wren because he believed Winter would be with her, believed he could seize her before Shadowpeak could mount a proper defense. Instead, he had taken the one person whose knowledge of curses and old magic might be crucial to breaking Corvus's affliction. And Corvus had gone after them alone, which meant he was operating on rage and instinct, which meant the curse would be worse, control more tenuous. "I need to speak with Paxton immediately," Winter said, authority she did not know she possessed, making her voice firm despite her fear. She found the beta in the courtyard, organizing riders, his face set in lines of controlled fury. He looked up as Winter approached, something like relief flashing through his expression. "Thank the old gods you are safe. When we discovered the attack, I feared they had taken you." "They wanted to. They got Wren instead." Winter moved close enough to speak quietly, not wanting the assembled warriors to overhear. "Corvus went after them alone. The separation from me, the rage, the fear, all of it will feed the curse. He could lose control completely. I need, which is why I am taking 20 of our best warriors and tracking them now." Paxton swung onto his horse with practiced ease, then paused, looking down at her with an expression that held both respect and concern. "You should remain here where it is safe. Malric wants you, and riding into potential combat would be exactly what he hopes for. And if Corvus transforms completely, if he becomes the beast and cannot find his way back to human form, you will have to kill him to stop him, and that will destroy you." Winter met his eyes steadily. "I am the only one who has successfully talked him down from the edge. You need me there." Paxton was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing risks, then cursed quietly and extended a hand. "You ride with me then, but you stay back from any fighting, and if I tell you to run, you run. Understood?" Winter took his hand, let him pull her up behind him on the horse. "Understood." They rode hard into the mountains, following tracks that were deliberately obvious, breadcrumbs Malric wanted them to follow. The ambush site was easy to find, the overturned cart and signs of brief struggle visible in churned snow and mud. Blood stained the ground, not much, but enough to confirm injury. Paxton dismounted briefly to examine the scene, his expression darkening. 15, maybe 20 attackers. They knew exactly when the cart would pass, which means someone provided information. He swung back onto his horse, his jaw tight with anger at the implication of betrayal. Wren fought them. There are signs of magic use, burn marks on trees, but they overwhelmed her through numbers. They followed the trail deeper into wilderness, into areas where the mountains became truly wild, where pack territory gave way to unclaimed lands that belonged to no one and harbored dangers both natural and supernatural. Winter felt the temperature dropping steadily, her borrowed cloak insufficient against the bitter wind that cut through the passes. But beneath the physical cold, she felt something else, a pull that had nothing to do with direction and everything to do with the bond between her and Corvus, a compass pointing toward him with increasing urgency. "He is close," she said quietly against Paxton's back, "and he is not fully human anymore." They found him in a narrow ravine where Malric's forces had attempted to make a stand, and it had clearly gone catastrophically wrong. Bodies littered the ground, some still recognizable as human, others torn apart with such violence that identification would be impossible. Blood painted the snow in arterial sprays, and the air stank of death and fear, and something wild that made the horses scream and try to bolt despite their training. Corvus stood in the center of the carnage, and he was barely recognizable. His form was caught somewhere between human and wolf, a nightmare configuration that should not exist, too large and wrong. His bones restructured in ways that created something monstrous. His eyes blazed pure gold, with no trace of human consciousness behind them, and blood covered him from head to foot, whether his own or his victim's, impossible to determine. When he saw them approach, he roared, a sound that shook rocks loose from the ravine walls, and Winter felt through the bond the terrible absence of the man she knew, only the beast remaining, trapped in transformation and drowning in rage. "Stay back," Paxton commanded the warriors who had frozen at the sight. "All of you, maintain distance. Winter, I do not know if this will work, but if anyone can reach him, it will be you." Winter slid from the horse, her legs nearly buckling as terror flooded through her. This was not the Corvus who had spoken to her gently, who had maintained careful distance to protect her, who had fought so desperately for control. This was the beast the territories feared, the monster the curse had created, and approaching him was very likely suicide. But she remembered his words in the tower, remembered the promise that she would not face her demons alone, and she would not let him face his alone either. She walked forward slowly, her hands visible and empty, speaking quietly. "Corvus, I know you are in there somewhere, beneath the rage. I know you can hear me." The beast's eyes fixed on her, and she saw no recognition in them, only Predator's assessment of prey. He moved toward her with frightening speed, and she heard Paxton shout her name in warning, but she held her ground, refusing to run, even though every instinct screamed at her to flee. "You promised you would not harm me," Winter said, her voice shaking but steady. "You promised I was safe with you. I am holding you to that promise, Corvus Iron Maw. Come back to yourself." He stopped perhaps 5 feet away, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his transformed body, could smell blood and rage and something underneath that was purely him. A low growl emanated from his chest, sustained and dangerous, but he did not attack. She took that as permission to continue. "I remember everything now, every moment of my life, every loss, every wound. The collar is broken, and I am whole again. Or as whole as someone can be after what was done to me." She took a careful step closer, watching for any sign that he would strike. "But I also remember the past weeks here with you. I remember you fighting so hard to maintain control, to protect me from the curse. I remember you teaching me to defend myself, eating meals across the room because proximity was painful, but you wanted to be near me anyway. I remember you, Corvus, all of you, man and wolf and beast. And I accept all of it. Do you hear me? I accept all of you." Something flickered in those gold eyes, a spark of consciousness struggling to surface through the curse's dominion. His massive form shuddered, bones cracking as they tried to reshape again, the transformation fighting between configurations, unable to complete in either direction. He made a sound that was equal parts howl and human agony, and Winter felt his pain through the bond like knives in her own chest. She did something that might have been bravery or stupidity, moving close enough to place her hand against his blood-soaked chest, feeling the frantic hammering of his heart beneath her palm. "You are not just the beast. You are not just the curse. You are Corvus, Alpha King of Shadow Peak, my mate. And you are stronger than the magic that tries to control you. Come back to me, please." The change was not instantaneous, but gradual, painful, his body slowly collapsing back toward human form with sounds that made Winter wince in sympathy. She stayed close throughout, her hand maintaining contact, providing an anchor point he could orient himself toward. When he finally lay on the blood-stained snow in fully human form, naked and covered in wounds and utterly exhausted, his eyes met hers with devastating clarity. "Winter." Her name emerged as barely a whisper. "I could have killed you. You should not have come close. You would not have killed me. I knew that even if you did not." She stripped off her cloak, covered him with it, despite the inadequacy. "Where is Ren?" "Cave, 50 yards east, guarded by 5 of Malric's warriors I left alive for questioning." He tried to sit up and failed, his strength completely depleted. Malric was not here. He sent his men but remained safely back in Northmere. Coward. Paxton and several warriors approached cautiously now that Corvus was clearly human again, the beta's relief visible. "We will retrieve Ren and secure the prisoners. Can you shift to wolf form? It would be easier to transport you that way." "Cannot shift at all right now. The transformation depleted everything." Corvus's eyes remained on Winter, something raw and vulnerable in his expression. "I lost control completely, became exactly what the curse wants me to be. And you came back. That is what matters. Winter looked up at Paxton. "We need to get him to the castle, get Ren, and decide how to respond to this. Malric has committed open acts of war. He cannot be allowed to retreat behind political niceties now." They found Ren in the cave as Corvus had indicated, bound but unharmed, the old healer more angry than frightened. The 5 warriors Corvus had left alive were indeed alive, though deeply traumatized by their encounter with the fully transformed Alpha King. They spoke readily enough under Paxton's questioning, confirming that Malric had ordered Winter's capture, that he planned to kill her quietly and present her body to Shadowpeak as tragic accident, that he grew increasingly unstable as news of her survival spread through neighboring territories. The journey back to Shadowpeak took hours, Corvus riding with Paxton while Winter rode with another warrior, the prisoners bound and walking under guard. Night had fallen by the time they reached the castle, torches blazing to light their return. Ren immediately took charge of treating Corvus's wounds, muttering darkly about foolish alphas who thought themselves invincible, while Winter stood by feeling useless and exhausted, and increasingly aware that the confrontation in the ravine had changed something fundamental between her and Corvus. He had been completely lost to the curse, and she had reached him anyway, had walked into the jaws of death and pulled him back through sheer force of will and acceptance. The mate bond between them had solidified into something unbreakable, forged in blood and trust and the willingness to risk everything for someone who had become essential in ways that transcended logic or reason. But Malric remained free, remained in power, remained a threat that would not simply disappear. And now he had committed acts that could not be ignored or dismissed, had drawn lines that demanded response. Winter understood with cold clarity that the time for careful planning and political maneuvering had passed. What came next would be decided not in negotiation, but in violence, not through words, but through the ancient law of tooth and claw. And she would need to be not just survivor, but warrior, if she hoped to reclaim what had been stolen and ensure Malric Stoneheart finally answered for his crimes. The girl who had been sent to die a sacrifice was gone, burned away in the fires of returned memory and hard-won strength. What remained was Winter Calloway, alpha-born and mate-claimed, and she was done being hunted. It was time to become the hunter instead. Word of the ambush spread through pack networks with the speed of wildfire, carried by witnesses and survivors, embellished and distorted with each retelling, until the story took on mythical proportions. The Beast King had slaughtered 20 warriors single-handedly while protecting his mate. The dead Alpha's daughter had returned to claim her birthright. Malric Stoneheart's treachery was exposed for all to see. Within 3 days, representatives from 6 neighboring packs arrived at Shadowpeak.
As requesting audience, seeking to understand the political implications, to determine where their own allegiances should fall in the conflict that was clearly coming. Winter stood beside Corvus in the Great Hall as he received them, no longer hiding in towers, but present and visible, wearing a gown of deep blue that had belonged to his mother, her copper hair braided in the complex style of Alphaborn, every inch of her bearing proclaiming her identity and her claim. The representatives studied her with open curiosity, weighing her resemblance to Alaric Calloway against Malric's accusations of madness, calculating which version of truth served their political interests best. Northmere Pack calls for formal counsel, declared the representative from Iron Ridge, a stern woman named Helena whose gray-streaked hair and scarred hands spoke of long years of leadership. Malric Stoneheart's legitimacy is in question. If Winter Calloway's accusations hold merit, his claim to alpha status is void, and every treaty signed under his authority becomes questionable. This affects all of us. Malric will not attend a council he knows will rule against him, Corvus said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. He has committed to his course. He attempted to murder my mate twice now, first through sending her as sacrifice, then through open ambush. He understands there is no political resolution that allows him to retain power. His only option is to eliminate Winter before formal proceedings can occur. Then we force the issue. This from a younger male alpha named Brennan of Stormwatch, his amber eyes sharp with intelligence. We march on Northmere with combined forces, present him with ultimatum, submit to council judgment, or face collective action.
That risks civil war, Helena countered. Some packs may side with Malric out of self-interest or fear of instability. We could fracture the entire Northern Alliance. Winter listened to them debate, feeling frustration build with each circular argument, each political calculation that treated her murdered parents and stolen life as abstract concepts to be weighed against territorial concerns. Finally, she spoke, her voice cutting through the discussion with unexpected authority. You are all dancing around the central issue. Malric Stoneheart murdered my parents in violation of every law we hold sacred. He used memory magic to hide his crime and enslaved their heir. These are not political questions. They are crimes that demand justice, and I am the one with the right to call for that justice. I challenge Malric Stoneheart to formal combat for the alpha position of Northmere Pack. Silence fell across the hall, every eye turning to her. Corvus's hand found hers, his grip tight, concern radiating through the mate bond. Winter, you have been training for barely 2 weeks. Malric has 45 years of experience and no honor. He will not fight fair. I know. But a formal challenge cannot be refused without forfeiting all claim to leadership. If he refuses, he admits guilt. If he accepts, I have the opportunity to kill him myself, which is justice my parents deserve. Winter met each representative's gaze in turn. And I will not be fighting alone. Pack law allows the challenge to bring allies. I will have Corvus and Shadowpeak's warriors at my back. Helena's weathered face split in a fierce smile. The girl has spine. I like that. Very well. Iron Ridge will stand witness to the challenge and enforce pack law. Malric cannot refuse or hide without destroying what remains of his reputation. The other representatives agreed with varying degrees of enthusiasm, recognizing that a formal challenge provided the cleanest solution, a way to resolve the succession crisis through traditional means that no pack could dispute. Messages were sent, carried by riders who departed within the hour, formal notice of challenge that would reach Malric by the following day. Winter felt the weight of what she had committed to settling on her shoulders, but beneath the fear lived fierce satisfaction. She would face her parents' murderer directly, and one way or another, the truth would be settled in blood. Corvus found her alone in the training courtyard after the representatives departed, standing in falling snow and staring at nothing. He approached slowly, his presence announcing itself through the bond before his physical arrival. And when he spoke, his voice carried layers of complicated emotion. You should have discussed that with me before issuing the challenge. Would you have tried to talk me out of it? Winter asked, without turning. Yes, because you are not ready, because Malric is dangerous, because I cannot bear the thought of losing you when I only just found you. He moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. But I also understand why you needed to be the one to issue it. This is your justice to claim, your parents to avenge. I will not take that from you. I am terrified, admitted quietly. I remember my father's skill, his strength. Malric defeated him through treachery and numbers. But in fair combat, he was formidable. I have trained for weeks where he has trained for decades. The odds are not in my favor. Then we improve the odds. Corvus turned to face her fully, his amber gold eyes intense. We have 4 days before the challenge date. 4 days to teach you everything I can, to prepare you as much as possible. And you have advantages Malric does not anticipate. What advantages? Your wolf. The collar suppressed your ability to shift for 5 years, but you are alpha-born. Your wolf form will be powerful, and Malric does not know you can access it now. That surprise could save your life. He extended his hand, an invitation. But first, you need to shift, need to remember how. And that means going into the mountains, away from witnesses, where you can learn without fear of judgment. They left immediately, just the 2 of them, riding into wilderness until civilization fell away behind them, and only stone and snow and ancient forest remained. In a clearing surrounded by pines heavy with winter's burden, Corvus dismounted and began removing his clothes unself-consciously, the practicality of someone for whom nudity was simply prerequisite to transformation. Winter followed suit more hesitantly, the cold biting her skin, vulnerability making her uncertain, despite the mate bond's assurance of safety. The shift is instinct and will, Corvus said, his voice already roughening as he prepared to demonstrate. Your body knows how, even if you have forgotten. You simply need to stop fighting it, stop holding yourself rigidly human, and let the wolf emerge. She watched him shift, the transformation flowing like water despite the curse, his human form dissolving into something massive and powerful and undeniably wolf. He was enormous, easily twice the size of a natural wolf, his fur black as midnight, his eyes blazing gold even in animal form. Beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, raw power contained in muscle and fang and ancient predator grace. He moved toward her slowly, unthreatening, and pressed his massive head against her hand, the gesture unmistakably reassuring. Winter closed her eyes, reached for the wolf inside herself that she dimly remembered from childhood, before the collar had locked it away. At first, nothing happened, her body remaining stubbornly human, 5 years of suppression creating barriers that her will alone could not immediately overcome. Frustration built, then anger, rage at everything that had been stolen from her, and that rage became the key that unlocked what had been imprisoned. The shift hurt, her body remembering pain from the collar's suppression and transforming transformation into agony that drove her to her knees. Bones restructured, muscles tore and reformed, her senses exploding into overwhelming clarity as human limitations fell away. When it finished, she stood on 4 legs instead of 2, seeing the world through eyes that detected movement and heat with predator precision, smelling things she had no names for, hearing the heartbeat of prey animals hiding in the underbrush half a mile away. Corvus's wolf moved beside her, his presence grounding, and through the bond she felt his pride, his satisfaction at seeing her whole in ways she had not been for years. He took off running, and instinct drove her to follow, chasing him through the forest in a dance that was equal parts hunt and play and courtship ritual older than language. They ran until exhaustion claimed them both, until Winter's newly remembered wolf form demanded rest, and they shifted back to human in the shelter of an overhang that provided minimal protection from wind but felt like sanctuary nonetheless. Your wolf is strong, Corvus said, pulling her against his chest for warmth, his body heat a buffer against the brutal cold. Faster than mine, more agile. In combat, you use that. Stay mobile. Do not let Melric pin you down. Strike and retreat until he makes a mistake. They talked tactics and strategy as the sun set and temperature plummeted, as stars emerged in a sky so clear and cold it felt like the universe itself watched them. Corvus taught her things he had learned in decades of combat, dirty tricks and survival instincts, how to read an opponent's intentions through subtle shifts in weight and gaze, where to strike to disable rather than kill when mercy was warranted, and where to strike when it was not. Winter absorbed it all, understanding that these lessons might be all that stood between her and death when she faced Malric. The following days passed in intensive preparation, dawn to dusk training that left Winter's body screaming and her mind sharp with focused purpose. Paxton joined the sessions, providing different fighting style for her to adapt to, teaching her how to fight opponents larger and stronger through speed and unpredictability. Ran worked with her on the mental aspects, meditation techniques to maintain clarity under stress, breathing patterns to manage fear and pain, old knowledge passed down through generations of healers, so understood that battles were won as much in the mind as the body. On the eve of the challenge, representatives from 9 packs had gathered at the designated neutral ground, a clearing in Northmere territory that had historically been used for formal challenges and pack gatherings. Temporary camps sprouted like strange flowers, hundreds of witnesses assembling to observe what would determine not just Northmere's leadership, but potentially reshape political alliances throughout the Northern Territories. Winter stood at the edge of Shadow Peak's camp, watching fires bloom in the darkness, feeling the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. "You should rest," Corvus said from behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders with gentle pressure. "Tomorrow will demand everything you have. I cannot sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see my father dying, or I see myself failing, making some critical error that gives Malric the opening he needs." Winter leaned back against him, drawing strength from his solid presence.
What if I am not enough? What if training and rage and righteous anger are not sufficient against his experience? Then I will be there to ensure he does not kill you. Politics and pack law be damned. Corvus turned her to face him, his eyes fierce with protective intensity. You are not alone in this, Winter. You have never been alone since the moment our eyes met. Whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together. The challenge was set for noon, allowing the morning for final preparations and for more witnesses to arrive. Winter dressed in practical leather armor that allowed full range of movement, her copper hair braided back from her face, her hands steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. Shadow Peak's warriors assembled around her, 20 strong, Paxton at their head, a show of force that made clear any treachery would be met with overwhelming response. The clearing was vast, ringed by ancient stones that marked it as sacred space, neutral ground where pack law superseded individual authority. Perhaps 300 witnesses filled the surrounding area, representatives from every major pack in the Northern Territories, warriors and alphas and political powers all gathered to observe justice carried out through the oldest of their traditions. Helena of Iron Ridge stood at the clearing's center, her role as neutral arbiter acknowledged by all present, her weathered face stern with the weight of responsibility. Malric arrived with his own force, 30 warriors wearing Northmere's colors, and at their center, the man himself. He looked older than Winter remembered from their confrontation at Shadow Peak, stress having carved new lines in his face, his eyes carrying the hollow look of someone who had not slept well in days. But he moved with confidence, born of desperation, a man who understood this was his last chance to eliminate the threat Winter represented, that failure meant death or exile and the destruction of everything he had built on lies and murder. Griselda stood slightly apart from the warriors, her cold blue eyes finding Winter across the clearing. And for a moment something passed between them, recognition of two women trapped in webs spun by powerful men. Victims and accomplices both, impossible to separate one from the other. Then the moment passed, and Griselda's expression hardened back into the mask Winter remembered from her captivity. Helena raised her voice, projecting across the assembled crowd with the authority of someone accustomed to command. We are gathered under pack law to witness formal challenge. Winter Calloway, daughter of Alaric and Moira Calloway, challenges Malric Stoneheart for alpha position of Northmere Pack, with accusations of murder, usurpation, and crimes against pack law. The challenge is to first blood or submission in human form, to death or submission in wolf form. Do both parties accept these terms? I accept, Winter said, her voice carrying clearly despite her fear. Malric's response came slower, his eyes calculating, clearly weighing whether refusal might somehow serve him better. But too many witnesses watched, too many packs waited for his answer, and refusal would destroy him as thoroughly as defeat. I accept. Then let combat commence. Winter moved to the clearing center, watching Malric mirror her approach, and she saw the moment he truly looked at her, saw not the broken prisoner he had kept in darkness, but the woman she had become, trained and determined and backed by the Beast King's authority. Fear flickered through his expression, there and gone, quickly buried under bravado. They circled each other warily, both in human form initially, pack law requiring this stage before transformation was allowed. Malric struck first, testing her defenses with a quick jab that Winter parried easily. Years of training guiding his movements into predictable patterns. She countered with a strike at his knee, using speed as Corvus had taught her, and felt satisfaction when her blow connected, not hard enough to cripple, but enough to make him favor that leg, to plant the seed of doubt about his assumptions. The combat escalated, moving from testing strikes to genuine attempts at disablement, and Winter discovered that rage was a fuel that could carry her past exhaustion, past fear, past the voice in her head insisting she was outmatched. Malric fought with the vicious efficiency of someone who had survived decades of pack politics and physical challenges. His strikes meant to incapacitate rather than kill in this first stage, but Winter fought with something he could not match. She fought with the fury of a child who had watched her parents murdered, with the determination of a woman who had survived 5 years of hell,
with the love of a mate who believed in her even when she struggled to believe in herself. First blood was hers, a strike across Malric's forearm that opened skin and sent crimson spraying across winter-pale ground. By pack law, they could stop there, the challenge satisfied. But Winter saw in Malric's eyes that he would not stop, would not accept defeat, would push to the second stage where death was permitted, because he understood that her survival was his destruction. "I do not yield," Malric snarled, already beginning the shift to wolf form, his body contorting as transformation took him. "Neither do I," Winter responded, letting her own wolf rise, welcoming the pain of shifting, because pain meant she was alive, meant she was fighting, meant she was finally reclaiming what had been stolen. Two wolves faced each other across blood-stained snow, one dark gray and massive with age and experience, the other smaller but quicker, copper-red fur catching sunlight, storm-gray eyes blazing with righteous fury. They clashed with savage violence, teeth and claws seeking vulnerable flesh, fighting with the desperation of those who understood only one would leave this clearing alive. Winter used every tactic Corvus had taught her, staying mobile, refusing to let Malric use his superior weight to pin her, striking at legs and flanks and throat whenever openings appeared. But Malric had not survived 45 years through fair fighting. He feinted a lunge that drew Winter in close, then twisted with speed that belied his age, his jaws closing on her front leg with crushing force, bone cracking audibly. Pain exploded through Winter's consciousness, nearly breaking her concentration, nearly forcing a shift back to human form that would leave her defenseless. She could hear Corvus roaring from the sidelines, feel his desperate rage through the bond, knew he was fighting every instinct to intervene despite pack law forbidding it. Through the agony, Winter did something Malric did not anticipate. She stopped trying to pull away and instead lunged forward, using his grip on her leg as leverage to drive her own jaws toward his exposed throat. His eyes widened with shock, and he had to release her to avoid the strike, had to give ground or risk death. And in that moment of his defensive retreat, Winter struck with everything she had remaining, her jaws closing on the side of his neck, not the killing strike at the throat, but the disabling bite at the spine that severed nerve connections and rendered his back legs useless. Malric collapsed, his wolf form dragging itself forward with front legs alone, and Winter stood over him, her own leg dragging uselessly, but her jaws positioned for the killing strike, waiting for surrender that was required by pack law if he wished to live. The clearing had gone utterly silent, 300 witnesses holding their breath, waiting to see if the murderer would be granted the mercy he had never shown his victims. Malric shifted back to human form, the transformation rendering him vulnerable and broken, his lower body paralyzed from her strike, blood pooling beneath him. His eyes met hers, and she saw no remorse there, no acknowledgement of crimes or acceptance of justice, only rage at being bested, only calculation about whether begging might somehow save him. "I yield," he forced out through gritted teeth. "The challenge is yours. Northmere is yours." Winter shifted back to human as well, standing on one leg, her other hanging at a wrong angle, pain threatening to drag her into unconsciousness. Corvus was beside her instantly, supporting her weight, his presence the only thing keeping her upright. She looked down at Malric, this man who had destroyed her family and stolen her life, and felt the weight of her choice settling on her shoulders. "Pack law says I can grant mercy to one who yields," she said, her voice carrying across the silent clearing. "But you granted no mercy to my father when you drove a blade through his back. You granted no mercy to my mother when your wife poisoned her. You granted no mercy to me when you stole my identity and kept me as slave for 5 years. Why should I grant you what you never gave?" "Please," Malric whispered, and the word held no sincerity, only desperate survival instinct. "I yield. The law is clear." Winter looked at Helena, at the neutral arbiter whose word determined what pack law demanded. The old alpha met her gaze steadily. "The law allows mercy, but does not require it. The choice is yours, Winter Calloway, Alpha of Northmere."
There. Winter turned to where Griselda stood among the crowd, the woman who had helped murder her mother, who had delighted in her suffering, who had been complicit in every crime. Their eyes met across the distance, and Winter saw something unexpected: resignation, but also pleading, a silent communication that if Malric lived, the cycle of violence would not end, that mercy shown now would be answered with treachery later. "No," Winter said finally, her voice steady despite the pain and exhaustion. "I grant no mercy to murderers who show no remorse. Malric Stoneheart, you are condemned by your own actions, and I claim alpha right of execution for my parents' murders." She took the blade Paxton silently offered, and despite her injured leg, despite the way her hands shook with exhaustion, she drove it through Malric's heart with all the strength remaining to her, ending him as he had ended her father, with steel and certainty and justice finally delivered. The clearing erupted in voices, some approving, others shocked, but all acknowledging the legitimacy of what had occurred. Winter barely heard them, her consciousness fading as blood loss and exhaustion finally overwhelmed her. Corvus catching her as she collapsed, his voice the last thing she heard before darkness claimed her, promising that she was safe now, that it was over, that she had survived and won, and reclaimed everything that mattered. Winter woke 3 days after the challenge in a bed that smelled of pine and winter and the distinctive musk that was purely Corvus, which meant she was no longer in a tower room but somewhere far more intimate. Her leg throbbed with dull pain, splinted and wrapped, the bone healing slowly under Wren's care and the accelerated regeneration that came with being wolfkind. The room around her was vast, carved from black stone like everything in Shadow Peak, but softened with furs and tapestries, a massive fireplace keeping the space warm despite the mountain cold beyond thick walls. Corvus's chambers, she realized, which meant he had kept her close throughout her recovery, maintained the vigil he had promised. The man himself sat in a chair near the bed, his large frame folded into a position that looked profoundly uncomfortable, his head tilted back against the wall in exhausted sleep. Even unconscious, he looked fierce, dangerous, the predator never fully hidden beneath human skin. But there was vulnerability in sleep. The hard lines of his face softened slightly, and Winter felt something warm and complicated bloom in her chest, affection and gratitude, and something deeper that she was not quite ready to name, even though the mate bond hummed with recognition of what it was. She shifted slightly, and the movement woke him instantly, his amber gold eyes snapping open with the alertness of someone accustomed to danger, before recognition and relief flooded his features. "You are awake, finally. Wren said you would sleep for days, but watching you so still and pale tested my sanity more than I care to admit." "How long?" Winter's voice emerged rough from disuse, her throat dry. 3 days since the challenge. Your leg was badly broken, you lost significant blood, and your body was exhausted from everything you endured." Corvus moved to the bed, settling beside her with careful consideration for her injuries. "But you won, Winter. You faced Malric and defeated him, reclaimed Northmere, proved your identity before witnesses from 9 packs. Your parents have been avenged, and you are recognized as rightful alpha by every territory that matters." The memories returned in a rush. The combat, the pain, the moment she had driven steel through Malric's heart and watched the light fade from his eyes. She had killed him, had ended a life despite every instinct that said taking life was wrong, and she waited for the guilt or horror or regret that should accompany such an act. Instead, she found only grim satisfaction, a sense of balance restored, justice delivered to one who had escaped it for far too long. Perhaps that made her as monstrous as the beast Malric had tried to create through his cruelty, or perhaps it simply made her practical, someone who understood that some threats could only be resolved through permanent removal. "What happened with Griselda?" Winter asked, "and Northmere's pack members? Did they challenge my claim?"
Griselda testified before the assembled alphas, revealed everything about the murders, about the memory suppression collar, about Malric's crimes and her complicity in them. Then she formally renounced all claim to Northmere and requested exile rather than execution. Corvus's expression was complicated. Helena granted the request. Griselda departed to the Western Territories where no one knows her history, with the understanding that if she ever returns north, she forfeits the mercy shown. "You disagree with that decision," Winter observed, reading his tone. "I believe she was as much Malric's victim as his accomplice, controlled through magical means and fear for long enough that her culpability is questionable. But I also believe she
took pleasure in your suffering, and that should have been answered with harsher judgment." He shrugged, a rolling of massive shoulders. "But the decision was not mine to make, and Helena is known for wisdom. Perhaps exile serves justice adequately." "And Northmere?" Winter pressed. "Waiting for you. The pack members who survived Melric's rule are eager to meet their true alpha, to swear loyalty to Calloway bloodline as they should have been allowed to do 15 years ago. Some fled during Malric's reign, but word has been sent that it is safe to return, that the usurper is dead and rightful leadership restored." Corvus took her hand carefully, his calloused fingers gentle against her smaller ones. "When you are healed enough to travel, we will go to Northmere together. You will claim your territory officially, and we will begin the work of repairing what Malric's rule damaged." The prospect was overwhelming, the weight of leadership settling on shoulders that had barely grown accustomed to freedom, let alone responsibility for an entire pack's welfare. "I do not know how to be an alpha. I was 8 years old when they killed my parents. I have fragmented memories of my father's lessons, but nothing that prepared me to actually lead." "Then you learn. I will help you. Paxton will help you. Every alpha who witnessed your challenge and saw your courage will help you if you ask. Leadership is not something you are born knowing, Winter. It is something you grow into through experience and guidance and the willingness to put your pack's needs before your own comfort." Corvus squeezed her hand gently. "And you have already demonstrated every quality that matters. Strength, yes, but also the willingness to face fear rather than hide from it, the capacity to make hard choices when necessary, the determination to protect those who cannot protect themselves. You will be a good alpha because you understand suffering and will work to prevent others from experiencing what you endured." Over the following weeks, Winter's leg healed under Wren's careful supervision, the bone knitting itself back together with the enhanced regeneration of wolfkind, until she could walk without limping, then run, then shift to wolf form and back without the injury-causing complications. Her body recovered its strength, muscle building on a frame that would never be imposing, but was quick and resilient, designed for endurance rather than overwhelming force. She trained daily with Paxton and Corvus, continuing to develop skills that had saved her life in the challenge, understanding that threats would not end simply because Malric was dead, that the world was full of those who would test a young female alpha's authority if given opportunity. But beyond physical training, she began learning the political and administrative aspects of leadership. Corvus opened his records to her, showed her how territories were managed, how disputes were mediated, how alliances were formed and maintained through careful diplomacy. Helena of Ironridge visited for a week, sharing wisdom accumulated over 4 decades of leading her own pack, teaching Winter the subtle art of reading people and situations, of knowing when to stand firm and when to compromise, of distinguishing threats that required immediate response from those that would resolve themselves if given time and patience. The mate bond between Winter and Corvus deepened throughout this period, proximity and shared purpose creating intimacy that transcended the physical. They talked long into the nights, sharing histories and fears and dreams, learning each other with the thoroughness of those who understood they would spend lifetimes together and wanted to build their foundations solidly. There were moments of tenderness that stole Winter's breath, the way Corvus looked at her when he thought she was not watching, the careful way he touched her as if she were something precious that might break if handled roughly, the fierce protectiveness that colored every interaction, even now when she was no longer helpless or in immediate danger.
There were also moments of passion, the mate bond's physical demands becoming impossible to ignore, kisses that started gentle and became desperate, touches that mapped skin and scars, and the landscape of desire that existed between two people who had found each other against impossible odds. Winter learned the shape of him, the places that made him gasp or growl, the way he whispered her name like a prayer when pleasure overwhelmed his careful control. And he learned her with equal thoroughness, patient and attentive, ensuring her first experiences of intimacy were nothing like the violation and powerlessness that had characterized so much of her life, but instead were about choice and mutual pleasure and the joy of two souls recognizing their perfect complement. 6 weeks after the challenge, they traveled to Northmere, accompanied by Paxton and 20 Shadow Peak warriors, a show of support and strength that announced Winter's authority was backed by the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories. The journey took 3 days,
winding through mountains and forests that Winter half remembered from childhood, places her father had taken her to teach tracking and survival skills. Each familiar landmark brought floods of memory, bittersweet recognition of what had been lost, but also determination that she would rebuild what Malric had destroyed, restore her pack to prosperity and safety. Northmere Castle was smaller than Shadow Peak, built from gray stone rather than black, situated in a valley where forests met grasslands and herds of game animals moved in seasonal patterns that had sustained the pack for generations. The building showed signs of neglect, windows dark, courtyards overgrown, the general air of a place that had been administered by someone who cared more about extracting resources than maintaining infrastructure. But bones were good, the structure sound, and Winter felt an unexpected surge of possessive affection looking at it. This had been her home, and it would be her home again, would be restored to what it should have been if tragedy had not intervened. The pack members gathered in the main courtyard, perhaps 80 strong, those who had survived Malric's rule and chosen to remain rather than seek safety in other territories. They ranged from elderly pack elders who remembered Winter as a child to young adults who had been born during the usurpation, all watching her with expressions that mixed hope and uncertainty, and the wariness of those who had learned not to trust authority too readily. Winter recognized a few faces, people who had been kind to her in the brief period before the murders, and seeing them alive and whole eased something tight in her chest. An elderly man stepped forward, his hair white, his frame stooped with age, but his storm-gray eyes sharp with intelligence. "Winter Calloway, I am Magnus, your father's beta before Malric took his place. I was too old to challenge him, too weak to protect you, and I have lived with that shame for 15 years. But I am here now to swear loyalty to you as I once swore it to your father, if you will accept oath from one who failed you." Winter felt tears prick her eyes, remembering Magnus from childhood, his patient instruction in mathematics and strategy, the way he had made her father laugh with dry observations about pack politics. "I remember you, Magnus. You taught me to play chess, and you always let me win until I was good enough to earn victories legitimately. I accept your oath, and I hold no blame against you for what Malric did. No one could have anticipated his betrayal or prevented the murders once he committed to that course." The formal oath-swearing ceremony took hours, each pack member approaching individually to pledge loyalty, to acknowledge her as rightful alpha, to promise service and obedience in exchange for her protection and leadership. Some were emotional, expressing relief that Calloway bloodline had been restored. Others were more reserved, clearly waiting to judge her by actions rather than lineage. But all swore, and by sunset, Winter stood as uncontested alpha of Northmere Pack, the position her father had held that should have been hers 15 years earlier, finally claimed through blood and determination and the refusal to let injustice stand. That night, there was a feast, humble by necessity given Northmere's depleted resources, but joyful nonetheless, celebration of new beginning and old wrongs finally addressed. Winter sat at the high table with Corvus beside her, Magnus on her other side, and felt the surreal quality of the moment wash over her. 6 months ago, she had been a prisoner without name or memory, waiting to die. Now she was alpha, mate to a king, surrounded by people who looked to her for guidance and protection. Corvus leaned close, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "You are doing well.
Your father would be proud of the woman you have become. I wish he could have seen it. I wish my mother could have known I survived, that I reclaimed what they died protecting." Winter blinked back tears, refusing to let grief overwhelm what should be a happy occasion. "But I will honor their memory through how I lead, through building the kind of pack they envisioned. That will have to be enough." In the weeks that followed, Winter threw herself into the work of restoration with fierce dedication. She met with every pack member individually, learning their concerns and skills, identifying those who could be trusted with responsibility and those who needed guidance to develop their potential. She assessed Northmere's resources, discovered that Malric had been embezzling funds and allowing infrastructure to decay while enriching himself, and began the slow process of rebuilding through careful budgeting and strategic allocation. She mediated disputes that had festered under Malric's indifferent leadership, applied the lessons Helena had taught her about reading people and situations, earned respect through fairness even when decisions were difficult. Corvus remained for the first month, his presence providing stability and support, his experience invaluable as Winter navigated the complexity of actual leadership versus theoretical understanding. But eventually, he needed to return to Shadow Peak, to his own territories and responsibilities that could not be neglected indefinitely. The separation was difficult, the mate bond protesting the distance. But they managed through frequent visits, through nights spent running together in wolf form across the lands that bordered their territories, through the absolute certainty that distance was temporary and their commitment to each other was permanent. On a spring morning, 6 months after reclaiming Northmere, Winter stood on the castle battlements watching her pack train in the courtyard below, seeing the transformation that had occurred through dedicated effort and collective will. Northmere was healing, becoming prosperous again, the neglect and fear of Malric's reign gradually replaced by cautious hope and growing confidence. There were still challenges, still moments when Winter felt overwhelmed by the responsibility, still nights when nightmares brought back memories of captivity and loss. But there were also moments of profound satisfaction, of watching her pack thrive, of knowing she had turned suffering into strength, had refused to let trauma define her future. Corvus arrived that afternoon, riding into Northmere at the head of a small delegation, and Winter's heart lifted at the sight of him, the mate bond singing with joy at proximity after 2 weeks of separation. He dismounted and pulled her into his arms with the easy affection of someone who no longer questioned his right to such intimacy, his kiss thorough and possessive and filled with everything words could not adequately express. "I have a proposal," he said when they finally broke apart, his amber gold eyes intense on hers. "A formal one, though I suspect you know what I am going to ask." "Ask anyway," Winter said, smiling despite the way her pulse had accelerated. "Winter Calloway, Alpha of Northmere, my mate, the most stubborn and courageous woman I have ever known. Will you formally bond with me? Will you join Northmere and Shadow Peak through marriage alliance? Unite our territories and our lives in ways that go beyond the mate bond? Build a future together that honors what we have survived and creates something new and strong and lasting?" The answer required no thought, had been written in her heart since the moment he had run rather than risk harming her, since he had talked her through recovered memories and taught her to fight and stood beside her as she reclaimed her birthright. Yes, to all of it, yes. The formal bonding ceremony took place on the summer solstice, in the clearing where Winter had challenged Malric, the space cleansed and reconsecrated as a place of beginning rather than ending. Representatives from 12 packs attended, bearing witness to the union of Northmere and Shadow Peak, the alliance that would reshape political power in the Northern Territories. Winter wore a gown of silver that caught sunlight and made her look like something from legend, her copper hair unbound and flowing to her waist, her storm gray eyes bright with emotion. Corvus wore black and silver, his presence commanding, his expression when he looked at his bride, holding such naked love and pride that several witnesses later admitted to tears. The ceremony followed ancient traditions, blood mingled and promises spoken, vows that bound them not just as mates, but as partners in leadership, as equals who would support and challenge each other, as two individuals who had found in each other the strength to become more than they could ever be alone. When the final words were spoken and they were declared formally bonded, the assembled crowd erupted in celebration, and Winter and Corvus stood together at the center of it all, knowing that their story was not ending, but rather beginning in earnest. That night, they ran together through forests that spanned both their territories, wolf forms racing under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, howling their joy to a moon that had witnessed everything they had survived and overcome. That night, they were no longer the cursed king and the forgotten prisoner, no longer separate and isolated and diminished by circumstances beyond their control. They were Winter and Corvus, alpha pair, partners, mates, two souls that had recognized each other in darkness and chosen to walk together into the light. And in a tower room in Northmere Castle, in the space that had once imprisoned her but now served as her study, Winter kept a single piece of the collar that had stolen her identity, a reminder of what she had survived and what she refused to ever become again. Not a victim, but a survivor who had transformed suffering into strength, who had reclaimed everything that mattered, who had learned that freedom was not the absence of chains, but the courage to break them and the determination to ensure no one else had to wear them. She was Winter Calloway, and her story, born in betrayal and forged in blood, had finally found its rightful ending, in love, in justice, and in the fierce joy of living on her own terms.